She pulled me aside on my wedding day, away from my husband, away from our families, away from everyone who was celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. She pressed a small wooden box into my hands, her fingers cold against mine, and made me promise not to open it until she was gone. Then she walked away, without another word. For 15 years, I carried that box through 3 moves, 2 apartments, and 1 house. I never opened it. I almost forgot it existed. Until the funeral. Before I tell you what was inside that box, before I take you through the 15 years of silent tension, the confusion, the quiet cruelty, and the truth that changed everything, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because some secrets don't just change your past. They rewrite everything you thought you knew about the people you love. That I want to take you back to the beginning. Not to the wedding day, not to the moment she handed me that box, but to the first time I met Eleanor, my husband's mother. The woman who would spend the next 15 years making me feel like I was something she'd tracked in on her shoes. It was a Sunday afternoon in late September. The leaves were just starting to turn, that first hint of autumn when the air gets crisp and you can smell wood smoke from somewhere down the street. I was 24 years old, nervous in a way I'd never been before, clutching a bottle of wine I'd spent an hour picking out because I wanted her to like me. I wanted her to see what her son saw. I wanted her to welcome me into their family, like I'd always dreamed a mother-in-law would. I remember everything about that day. The way the light fell through her kitchen windows, the smell of roast chicken, and something that might have been rosemary, the sound of her heels clicking against the tile floor as she moved around the stove. She was elegant in a way I'd never learned to be, slim, well-dressed, her silver hair pulled back in a neat twist. She looked like the kind of woman who had dinner parties and knew which fork to use for salad. My husband, then just my boyfriend, had told me she was warm. He'd said she was excited to meet me. He'd promised me she would love me. But the moment I walked through that door, something shifted in her eyes. I saw it. I've always been good at reading people, and I read her like an open book in that instant. There was recognition in her face, but not the warm kind. It was the kind of recognition you have when you see something you were hoping you'd never see again. A ghost. A memory. A bad dream you thought you'd woken up from. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The smile was painted on, like a mask she'd worn so many times it had become second nature. She took my hand, not in a warm, enveloping hug, but with a cool, deliberate grip that lasted exactly 2 seconds before she let go. "Welcome," she said. "Daniel has told me so much about you." Her voice was polite, pleasant even, but there was an edge to it I couldn't quite place. Something guarded, something watching. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle rejection. She asked me all the right questions. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? What was my degree in? But she never seemed to actually listen to my answers. Her eyes would drift past me, to the window, to her son, to the wine glass she kept refilling. And every time I spoke, I noticed the way her jaw would tighten slightly, the way her fingers would curl around her fork just a little bit tighter. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was nervous, projecting my own insecurities, reading too much into the silences. Daniel, my future husband, seemed oblivious. He laughed and talked and made the kind of conversation that flows easily when you're comfortable in your own skin. He didn't seem to notice the way his mother's gaze would linger on me with that strange, unreadable expression. But I noticed. God, I noticed. After dinner, while Daniel was helping clear the dishes, Eleanor cornered me in the living room. She stood by the fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand, and studied me the way you might study a painting you're not sure you like. "Daniel tells me you work at a marketing firm," she said. "Just an assistant right now," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I'm working my way up. I have a lot of ideas about." He always did like women who were ambitious. It should have been a compliment, but the way she said it made it sound like a criticism, like ambition was something to be wary of. I tried to smile. "I think ambition is important. I want to build something for myself, you know?" Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "And for Daniel? What do you want to build with him?" The question caught me off guard. It felt like a test, but I didn't know the right answer. "I love him," I said, because it was the only thing I could think of. "I want to build a life with him. I want to make him happy." She took a long sip of her wine, and I could have sworn I saw something flicker across her face. Pain, maybe. or worry. Be careful with him, she said quietly. He's more fragile than he looks. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. I thought she was being protective, maybe a little overbearing, but essentially coming from a place of love. I didn't realize she was warning me. I didn't realize she was seeing someone else when she looked at me. A ghost I didn't even know existed. Eleanor, I said, reaching out to touch her arm. I would never hurt him. I love him more than anything. She flinched. Actually flinched, like my touch burned her. She pulled away, composing herself with practiced ease, and said, I'm sure you do. But her voice was hollow, empty. Like she'd said those words so many times, she'd worn them out. Daniel came back into the room then, his arms full of dirty plates, and I could see the tension in my shoulders release just a little. I was safe again. He was there. He wouldn't let anything happen to me. But he didn't see the way his mother looked at me. He didn't see the cold calculation in her eyes. He didn't notice the way she'd been studying me all night, looking for cracks, looking for signs, looking for something that would confirm what she already believed. That first meeting set the tone for our entire relationship. Over the next few years, as Daniel and I grew closer and our wedding plans took shape, Eleanor remained a constant presence, a polite, smiling, fundamentally cold presence. She never said anything outright mean. There were no dramatic confrontations, no tearful arguments, no shouting matches. That would have been easier in a way. At least then I would have known where I stood. Instead, she gave me the silent treatment wrapped in pleasantry. She'd show up to family dinners and nod along when I talked, but her eyes would drift away. She'd send me Christmas presents, something generic, like bath salts or a scarf that was clearly marked down, while giving Daniel thoughtful, personal gifts that showed how well she knew him. She'd comment on my weight, my career, my life choices, always couched in concern that was really just criticism in disguise. You look tired lately, she'd say. Are you sleeping well? Stress can really take a toll on your appearance. Marketing is such a volatile field, she'd say. I hope you're not putting too much pressure on yourself. It's important to know your limits. Are you sure you want to take on that project at work? I wouldn't want you to overextend yourself and fail. I told myself it was just her way. I told myself she was old-fashioned, worried about her son, maybe a little possessive. I told myself that every mother-in-law relationship had its ups and downs. I was young, and I was eager to please, and I wanted so desperately to be part of this family that I was willing to endure a little frost. But it wasn't just a little frost. It was a glacier. And over time, I started to believe that maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I didn't deserve her son. Maybe I was exactly the kind of woman she thought I was. Someone who would take and never give. Someone who would hurt her precious boy and leave him broken. That's what happens when someone treats you like a threat for long enough. You start to think, maybe you actually are a threat. Maybe you are the monster they see in you. The wedding planning was a nightmare. Eleanor had opinions about everything. The venue, the flowers, the catering, the dress. She'd call me with suggestions that were really commands, and if I pushed back even slightly, she'd sigh and say, well, it's your day. I just thought you'd want to do it right. Daniel never saw it. Or maybe he didn't want to. When I'd tell him about these calls, he'd say, that's just how she is.
She means well.
She's just excited. No, I wanted to scream. She doesn't mean well. She's trying to control everything. She's trying to make me feel small. But I didn't scream. I smiled and nodded and let her have her way because I was terrified of being the bad guy. I was terrified that if I pushed too hard, she'd win. She'd turn Daniel against me. She'd expose me as the fraud I was convinced I must be. On the morning of the wedding, I was a bundle of nerves. I stood in front of the mirror in my childhood bedroom, my mother zipping on my dress behind me, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was making the right choice, that I deserved this happiness. What if she's right? I whispered to my reflection. What if I'm not good enough? But my mother, practical and wise as ever, just laughed. Sweetheart, no mother-in-law is ever going to think anyone is good enough for her son. That's just how it is. It doesn't mean she's right. It just means she loves him. I nodded, wanting to believe her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. This wasn't just a possessive mother. This was something deeper. Something I couldn't name. The ceremony was beautiful. A picture-perfect affair in a church that looked like it had been built for exactly this purpose. White walls, stained glass windows casting colored light across the altar, flowers everywhere. Daniel looked so handsome in his tuxedo, his eyes shining with tears when he saw me walking down the aisle. I felt for a moment like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Like all the doubts and fears had been nothing more than pre-wedding jitters. And then Eleanor pulled me aside. It was during the reception, when everyone was dancing and laughing and drinking champagne. I was standing by the cake table, about to take a bite of the dessert I'd chosen after 3 months of tasting, when I felt a hand on my elbow. "Dear," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need a word with you." I followed her into a small side room, a storage space for the church's vestments, thinking maybe she was going to offer me some belated warm welcome. Maybe she was finally going to accept me. Maybe everything was going to be okay. Instead, she handed me the box. It was small, maybe 6 inches square, made of dark, polished wood. There was no inscription on it, no decoration, just a simple brass clasp. She pressed it into my hands with the same deliberate intensity she'd used when she'd first seen me at her dinner table. "This is for you," she said. "But you can't open it until I'm gone." "What?" I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean gone. Dead." Not a minute before. Her eyes were dark, serious, almost desperate. "Promise me, Lydia. Promise me you won't open this until I've passed. But, promise me." My heart was pounding. I didn't understand what was happening. Was this her way of being nice? Was this a threat? Was this a joke? "Eleanor, I don't understand. What's in it?" She shook her head. "I can't tell you. You'll understand when you open it, but not before. Please. This is important. This is the most important thing I've ever asked of you." My mind was racing. I thought of all the years of coldness, the subtle cruelty, the way she'd always looked at me like I was a stranger. And now this. A box. A secret. A promise. "I promise," I said, because what else could I do? It was my wedding day. I wanted to get back to my husband. I wanted to forget this strange, unsettling moment. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was her way of saying sorry. "I promise I won't open it until you're gone." She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. Then she nodded once, sharply, and walked away. I didn't see her again for the rest of the night. I shoved the box into the bottom of my suitcase and tried to forget about it. For 15 years, I succeeded. But at her funeral, as I stood in that quiet house surrounded by her things, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know. I had to open the box and confront whatever secret she'd been keeping from me for all those years. I had no idea that what I was about to find would destroy everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and the woman who had treated me like a stranger for 15 years. When we left off, I was standing at my mother-in-law's funeral, haunted by a promise I'd made 15 years earlier. She'd given me a wooden box on my wedding day and made me swear not to open it until she was gone. And now she was gone, and the box was sitting in my closet, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might be inside. The 15 years between that wedding night and Eleanor's funeral were a slow, steady erosion of my confidence and self-worth. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself she was just a difficult woman. I told myself I was lucky to have a mother-in-law who was at least civil, even if she wasn't warm. But I was lying to myself. The truth is, Eleanor's coldness seeped into every corner of my life. It colored my relationship with my husband, my view of myself, even my interactions with our children. I became defensive and guarded around her, always waiting for the next subtle jab, the next passive-aggressive comment, the next moment when she'd make me feel like I didn't belong. I remember one Christmas when I'd spent weeks planning the perfect family dinner. I'd cooked everything from scratch: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, 3 different kinds of pie. I'd decorated the house with garlands and twinkling lights. I'd bought thoughtful presents for everyone, wrapping them in matching paper with hand-tied bows. Eleanor arrived 2 hours late without calling to say she'd be delayed. She breezed through the door in a cloud of expensive perfume, a bottle of wine in one hand and a shopping bag in the other. "I'm so sorry I'm late," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "I was at the most wonderful gallery opening. The art was just breathtaking. You should have seen it, Daniel. It made me think of all the things you could have been if you hadn't. She stopped herself, glancing at me.
Well,
Never mind. I stood in the kitchen, my hands covered in flour, my carefully planned schedule crumbling around me. Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes, I said, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. I hope you're hungry. She smiled that cold smile. I'm sure it will be lovely. You always try so hard. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her what her problem was, why she couldn't just be nice to me, why she had to make everything so difficult. But I didn't. I just smiled back and returned to my cooking, telling myself it didn't matter. Telling myself this was just how it was. But it did matter. It all mattered. Every sideways glance, every dismissive comment, every moment she made me feel like an outsider in my own family. It added up, piling on my shoulders like stones, until I felt crushed under the weight of it. The worst part was that I couldn't even talk to Daniel about it. He loved his mother, and he was blind to her flaws. When I tried to express my frustrations, he'd make excuses for her. She's just old-fashioned, he'd say. She worries about me. That's all. She's protective. It's just how she is. She doesn't mean anything by it. You're reading too much into it. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too sensitive, too defensive, too quick to see slights where none were intended. I started to believe that. I started to believe that I was the one who was wrong, that Eleanor was just a well-meaning woman whose bluntness I'd taken as cruelty. I started to question my own judgment, my own perceptions, my own worth. That's the insidious thing about gaslighting. It doesn't have to be overt. It can be 1,000 tiny cuts, each one so small you barely notice it, until one day you look down and realize you're bleeding out. By the time our first child was born, I was a shadow of my former self. I was terrified that Eleanor would judge my parenting choices, that she'd find fault with everything I did, that she'd use my child as another weapon against me. And she did. She was there in the delivery room, watching me struggle to push out her grandchild, offering helpful suggestions that were really just criticism. She was there in the early weeks, holding the baby with perfect confidence while I stood by helplessly, feeling like an incompetent fraud. She was there at every birthday party, every holiday, every family gathering, making sure I knew that I would never be good enough. I remember one particularly awful moment when our daughter was about 3. We were at a family barbecue, and the kids were playing in the backyard. My daughter, Lucy, fell and scraped her knee. She came running to me, crying, and I scooped her up and held her close, trying to soothe her. Eleanor appeared at my elbow, her face tight with disapproval. "You shouldn't coddle her," she said. "She needs to be tough. You're going to make her weak." "She's 3 years old," I said, my voice shaking with barely suppressed anger. "She's scared and she's hurt. She needs comfort, not a lesson in toughness. She needs to learn to handle things on her own." Eleanor's voice was cold, dismissive. "You can't protect her from everything. You're going to create a monster if you keep this up." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I saw something I'd never seen before. I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of me, not fear for her granddaughter, but fear of something else. Something deeper. Something I didn't understand. "You don't know me," I said quietly. "You've never known me. You've looked at me for 15 years and you've seen someone else, someone I'm not, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being judged for things I haven't done." Eleanor stared at me, her face unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her expression. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar mask of cold indifference. "You don't understand," she said. "You can't understand. You weren't there." "Were where? What are you talking about?" But she just shook her head and walked away, leaving me standing there with my crying daughter, feeling like I'd somehow failed a test I hadn't known I was taking. That was the moment I started to suspect there was more to Eleanor's coldness than simple dislike. There was something else going on, something she was hiding, something that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with some unresolved pain from her past. But I didn't pursue it. I was tired. I was worn down by years of conflict and confusion. I didn't have the energy to dig deeper, to uncover the secrets she was obviously keeping. I just wanted peace. I just wanted to be left alone. So I retreated further into myself. I pulled back from family gatherings, making excuses for why we couldn't attend. I stopped trying to win Eleanor's approval because I'd finally realized it was never coming. I focused on my marriage, my children, my career, things I could control, things that brought me joy. And for a while it worked. I found a kind of equilibrium, a way of existing in the same world as Eleanor without letting her poison my happiness. I learned to smile and nod and let her comments roll off me. I learned to build walls around my heart, walls she could never breach. But the box was still there, sitting in the back of our closet, gathering dust. I'd moved it 3 times, always keeping it in the same place, always telling myself I'd open it one day. But I never did. I was afraid of what I might find, afraid that it would confirm all my worst fears about myself, afraid that it would shatter the fragile peace I'd built. And then Eleanor died. She was 78 years old, still active and sharp, still ruling her little world with an iron fist. Her death was sudden, a heart attack in her sleep, discovered by the housekeeper the next morning. No warning, no decline, no chance to say goodbye. Daniel was devastated. Despite everything, he loved his mother deeply, and her death hit him like a physical blow. He cried for days, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but sit in his grief and let it consume him. I tried to be there for him. I held him while he wept. I made sure he ate. I handled all the funeral arrangements, so he wouldn't have to. But a part of me felt hollow. A part of me was relieved that Eleanor was gone. A part of me was glad I'd never have to endure her coldness again.
I felt guilty about that.
I knew I should be mourning her, the same way Daniel was. I knew I should be honoring her memory, thinking kindly of her, remembering the good times we'd shared, however few they'd been. But all I could feel was a strange kind of numbness, a sense that something heavy had been lifted from my shoulders. The funeral was held at the same church where we'd been married, which felt like a cruel joke. I stood in the back of the sanctuary, dressed in black, watching the procession of mourners file past Eleanor's casket. They all had stories to tell, how kind she was, how generous, how loving. I listened to them and felt like an alien. Who were these people talking about? Certainly not the woman I'd known. Daniel gave a beautiful eulogy, talking about his mother's strength, her determination, her fierce love for her family. He talked about the way she'd always protected him, always been there for him, always put him first. He talked about her as if she were a saint. I wanted to stand up and say, that's not who she was. Not to me. She was cold and cruel, and she made my life miserable for 15 years. But I didn't. I sat there in silence, my hands folded in my lap, my face a mask of polite grief. After the service, we gathered at Daniel's childhood home for the reception. It was the first time I'd been back to that house since Eleanor had died, and everything felt different. The rooms were smaller than I remembered, dimmer, quieter. It felt like a museum, not a home, a monument to a life that had ended. I wandered through the house, looking at the photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, the trinkets that Eleanor had collected over the years. I was looking for something, though I didn't know what. Some clue to who she really was. Some explanation for why she'd treated me the way she had. And then I remembered the box. It was like a shock of electricity, suddenly jolting me back to that moment 15 years ago. Eleanor's hand on my elbow, her urgent voice, the small wooden box pressed into my hands. Her promise, don't open it until I'm gone.
She was gone now.
The box was still in my closet, waiting for me, waiting to reveal whatever secret she'd been keeping for all those years. My heart was pounding as I drove home that night, Daniel silent and exhausted beside me in the passenger seat. All I could think about was the box. What was inside? Why had she given it to me? Why had she made me promise not to open it until after she died? I couldn't wait any longer. As soon as we got home, I made an excuse about needing to check on something in the bedroom, and I went straight to the closet. There it was, right where I'd left it. The same small wooden box, the same brass clasp, the same dark polished surface. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands, and my heart raced. I carried it out to the kitchen, where I could be alone. I set it on the table and stared at it for a long moment, my hands trembling. I was terrified of what I might find. Terrified that it would be confirmation of everything I'd always feared. terrified that it would destroy the fragile peace I'd finally achieved. And then I opened it. Inside the box was a letter, a photograph, and a ring I'd never seen before. I unfolded the letter with shaking hands and began to read the words Eleanor had written for me 15 years ago. The first sentence hit me like a physical blow. You were never who I was cold to. When we left off, I had finally opened the box my mother-in-law gave me on my wedding day. Inside was a letter, a photograph, and a ring I'd never seen before. And as I began to read Eleanor's letter, I discovered a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about the last 15 years. The letter began with those words, "You were never who I was cold to," and then it went on to explain everything. Eleanor wrote that she'd mistaken me for years, for someone else entirely. A woman who had hurt her son before he ever met me. A woman who looked so much like me that she couldn't see past the resemblance. A woman whose face had haunted her for a decade. Her name was Sarah. She was Daniel's first fiancée. They'd met in college, fallen deeply in love, and become engaged within a year. The wedding had been planned, the invitation sent, the dress bought and fitted. Everything was perfect, right up until 2 weeks before the ceremony, when Sarah had left Daniel for his own brother. I read those words and felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Daniel's brother, his own brother. The betrayal was staggering, a wound so deep it had never fully healed. Eleanor wrote about what it had been like to see her son reduced to a shell of himself. He'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped talking to anyone. He'd spent weeks in a state of near catatonia, unable to function, unable to process what had happened. The betrayal had broken something inside him, something that had taken years to mend. And then, just as he was starting to recover, just as he was starting to build his life back together, he'd met me. Someone who looked so much like Sarah that Eleanor's heart had seized up in fear. Eleanor explained that she'd tried to see me as my own person. She'd tried to separate me from the ghost of the woman who had destroyed her son. But every time she looked at me, she saw Sarah. Every time I smiled, she saw Sarah. Every time I touched her son, she saw Sarah. And she couldn't help but imagine history repeating itself. She wrote that she knew it was unfair. She knew I wasn't Sarah, that I'd done nothing wrong, that I was a good person who loved her son. But she couldn't stop the fear. It was like a poison in her blood, spreading through every interaction, tainting every moment. And so she'd been cold to me, not because she hated me, but because she was terrified. Terrified that I would do to Daniel what Sarah had done. Terrified that I would break his heart again. Terrified that she would have to watch him fall apart a second time. She wrote that she'd spent years trying to overcome her fears. She'd gone to therapy. She'd prayed. She'd tried to give me a chance. But the fear was too strong, too ingrained. Every time she saw me, she saw Sarah. Every time I disappointed her, even in the smallest way, it confirmed her worst fears. The photograph in the box was of Sarah, and the resemblance was uncanny. We had the same hair color, the same eye color, the same facial structure. We even smiled the same way, a wide, open smile that crinkled the corners of our eyes. I looked at the photo and felt a chill run down my spine. No wonder Eleanor had seen a ghost. She'd been staring at one for 15 years. The ring was Sarah's engagement ring. Daniel had given it to her when he proposed, and she'd thrown it in his face when she left him. Eleanor had found it, years later, tucked away in a drawer. She'd kept it as a reminder of the danger of trusting people, as a warning against letting history repeat itself. In the letter, Eleanor wrote that she decided to give me the box on my wedding day because she couldn't bear to keep the secret any longer. She'd wanted to tell me the truth, to explain why she was the way she was, but she hadn't been able to find the words. And so she'd written it all down, sealed it in the box, and made me promise not to open it until she was gone. I don't expect your forgiveness, she wrote. I don't deserve it. I've treated you unfairly for years, and I know that. But I need you to understand that it was never about you. It was always about her. About the ghost I couldn't let go of. About the fear I couldn't overcome. Please take care of my son, she wrote. He's been through so much, and he never talks about it. He thinks he's moved on, but I know him better than anyone. He's still broken. He's still carrying the weight of what Sarah did to him. He needs someone who can love him through that darkness. He needs someone who can help him heal. I hope that someone can be you. I sat there in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Relief? All of it somehow at once. The anger came first, hot and sharp, burning in my chest. All those years of coldness and cruelty, and it wasn't even about me. She'd been punishing me for something I hadn't done, something I hadn't even known about. She'd made my life miserable for 15 years because I looked like someone else. But then the sadness crept in, cold and heavy. I imagined what it must have been like for Eleanor, watching her son shatter, trying to put him back together, and then seeing his face fall apart again every time he looked at me. She'd been haunted by a ghost she couldn't escape, and I'd been the living reminder of everything she feared. And then there was the relief. A strange, unexpected sense of relief because finally I understood. The coldness wasn't my fault. The cruelty wasn't my fault. I wasn't the problem. I'd never been the problem. But understanding didn't erase the damage. It didn't take away the years of feeling worthless, of questioning my own judgment, of wondering if I was really as terrible as she seemed to think. Those scars didn't disappear just because I now understood their origin. And then there was Daniel, my husband, the man I'd loved for 15 years, the father of my children, the center of my world. And he'd never told me about any of this. He'd never mentioned a first fiancé, never told me about the betrayal, never even hinted that there was something in his past that might explain his mother's behavior. Why hadn't he told me? I remembered all the times I'd come to him, frustrated and hurt by Eleanor's coldness, and he'd made excuses for her. He'd said she was just old-fashioned, just protective, just worried. He'd brushed off my concerns as if they were nothing, as if I was overreacting. But he'd known. He'd known exactly why his mother was the way she was, and he'd never told me. He'd let me suffer, let me question myself, let me believe I was the problem. And he'd never said a word. The anger shifted, turning toward him. How could he keep something like this from me? How could he watch me struggle? Watch me cry, watch me beg for an explanation, and just not tell me. I thought about all the times I'd asked him, directly or indirectly, why his mother disliked me. I'd said, what did I do wrong? What can I do to make her like me? And he'd said, nothing. She's just like that. It's not personal. But it was personal. It was deeply, painfully personal. And he'd known it. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me, and I wept. I wept for the years I'd lost, the self-confidence I'd sacrificed, the relationship I'd always wanted with Eleanor but could never have. I wept for the woman who had been so consumed by fear that she'd pushed away the person who could have been her friend. And I wept for my husband, who'd carried the weight of Sarah's betrayal for so long that he'd forgotten how to let anyone in. But when the tears stopped, something else took their place. Something harder. Something colder. I was going to show him the letter. I was going to confront him with the truth he'd been hiding from me for 15 years. And I was going to demand an explanation. But first I needed to think. I needed to process. I needed to figure out what I was going to say. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions of life, while my mind was elsewhere. I went to work, I took care of the children, I made dinner and did laundry and smiled at the right moments. But inside, I was churning. The letter was burned into my brain, replaying over and over like a loop. Why hadn't he told me? That was the question that haunted me. What possible reason could he have for keeping such a huge secret from his wife? Did he not trust me? Did he think I'd react poorly? Did he think I'd use it against him somehow? Or was it simpler than that? Had he just forgotten? Had the wound healed over so completely that he'd pushed the memory out of his mind, along with the explanation for his mother's behavior?
No.
That didn't make sense. He'd known. He'd always known. He'd made excuses for Eleanor for years, and I'd never understood why. Now I knew. He was trying to protect her, trying to protect himself, trying to protect me, maybe, from a truth that he thought would only hurt me. But it wasn't his choice to make. It wasn't his right to decide what I could handle, what I needed to know, what I deserved to understand. He'd taken that choice away from me, and I was furious. I thought about confronting him immediately. I thought about storming into the living room, slamming the letter down on the coffee table, and demanding an explanation. I thought about screaming, crying, throwing things, anything to release the pressure building inside me. But I didn't do any of that. Instead, I waited. I planned. I thought about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. Because here's the thing about 15 years of being treated like you're not good enough. It teaches you patience. It teaches you to think before you act, to weigh your words carefully, to consider the consequences of every move you make. It teaches you that revenge is a dish best served cold. I wasn't looking for revenge. Not exactly. I wasn't trying to hurt Daniel or punish him or make him suffer the way I'd suffered. But I was looking for justice. I was looking for acknowledgement. I was looking for him to finally see me, really see me, and understand what he'd put me through. And I was going to make sure he did. So I waited. I gave myself time to process, to think, to decide what I wanted to say. I read the letter a dozen times, memorizing every word, until I could recite it in my sleep. I looked at the photograph of Sarah and tried to understand how anyone could mistake me for her. I held the ring in my hand and thought about the woman who'd thrown it away. And then, when I was ready, I went to find my husband. He was in his study, working on something on his laptop. He looked up when I came in, a small smile on his face, and I could see in his eyes that he had no idea what was coming. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" "No," I said. "Everything is not okay." I set the box down on his desk. The letter, the photograph, and the ring were still inside, just as I'd found them. His eyes flicked down to the box, and I watched his face change. The color drained from his cheeks. His mouth fell open. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "Your mother gave it to me," I said. 15 years ago. On our wedding day. She told me not to open it until she was dead. He looked at me, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked like fear. "You opened it?" I opened it. I met his gaze, holding it. And I read the letter. I saw the photograph. I saw the ring. And now I know everything. I watched my husband's face crumble as he realized the truth was finally out. For 15 years, he'd kept this secret from me. For 15 years, he'd let me suffer. And now he was going to have to explain himself. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that I'd already decided exactly how this was going to end. When we left off, I had finally confronted my husband with the truth about his mother's secret. The box, the letter, the photograph, the ring, everything was finally out in the open. And now, as he sat in his study with the color draining from his face, I was about to find out exactly how much he'd been hiding. And my husband looked at me, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not the kind of fear that comes from being caught in a lie, but the kind of fear that comes from being confronted with a truth you've been running from for too long. "Lydia," he started, his voice cracking. "Lydia, I can explain." I sat down across from him, my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully neutral. "I'm listening." He took a shaky breath, running his hands through his hair the way he always did when he was nervous. "I didn't know she gave you that box. I didn't know she'd written that letter. I swear to you, I had no idea." "Maybe not about the box," I said. "But you knew about Sarah. You knew why your mother was cold to me. And you never told me." He winced, looking away. "I didn't think it mattered. It was so long ago. I'd moved on." "I thought you'd moved on too." "Moved on?" I felt my anger rising, hot and sharp in my chest. "Moved on from what?" I didn't even know there was anything to move on from. I spent 15 years wondering what I'd done wrong, why your mother hated me, why I wasn't good enough. And all that time, you knew. You knew exactly what was going on, and you never said a word. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "I didn't want you to feel like you were being compared to her. I didn't want you to think that I was still hung up on someone else. I loved you, Lydia. I love you. I didn't want to burden you with my past." "Burden me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You didn't burden me. You left me in the dark. You let me think I was the problem. You let me believe that I wasn't good enough for your mother, for you, for anyone. And you never once thought to tell me the truth." He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I was afraid. I thought if you knew, you'd look at me differently. You'd see me as broken. You'd leave me the way she did." "Leave you?" I stared at him, incredulous. "Do you really think so little of me?" Do you think I would have run away just because you had a painful past? Do you think I would have blamed you for what someone else did to you? No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't think that now. But back then, I was so scared. I was terrified of losing you. I couldn't bear the thought of going through that again. So I buried it. I tried to forget. And when my mother started acting strange around you, I made excuses for her because I didn't want to admit what was really going on. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to unleash all the anger and hurt I'd been carrying for 15 years. But another part of me, the part that had read Eleanor's letter, the part that understood the weight of grief and fear and guilt, felt a strange kind of sympathy. He hadn't been trying to hurt me. He'd been trying to protect himself. He'd been so broken by Sarah's betrayal that he'd built walls around his heart, and he'd been too scared to let me in. His mother had been doing the same thing, in her own way. They'd both been so consumed by fear of the past that they destroyed any chance of a happy future. But understanding didn't make it right. Understanding didn't erase the pain or the years of feeling worthless. Understanding didn't give me back all the time I'd wasted wondering what was wrong with me. I needed time to think. I needed space to process. I needed to figure out what I wanted to do next. Daniel, I said, my voice steady, I need you to leave. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen with tears. What? I need you to leave. Not forever, I said quickly, seeing the panic in his face. Just for tonight. I need time to think. I need to process everything you've told me. I can't do that with you here. He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Okay, I understand. I'll go to my mother's house. I'll stay there until you're ready to talk. I watched him pack a small bag, his movements slow and mechanical. He looked like a ghost of himself, like the weight of 15 years of secrets had finally crushed him. And part of me felt sorry for him. But another part of me, the part that had been wounded and betrayed, stood firm. When he was gone, I sat alone in the house and thought about everything. The letter, the photograph, the ring, the years of coldness, the silence that had grown between us, a chasm we'd both been too scared to cross. And as I sat there, an idea began to form in my mind, a plan, a way to take all the pain and anger and confusion and turn it into something meaningful. I thought about Eleanor's letter, about how she'd apologized for her coldness and explained her fear. I thought about Daniel's confession, about how he'd been so wounded by Sarah's betrayal that he'd never been able to trust anyone fully. And I thought about myself, about the years I'd spent feeling like I wasn't enough. And I realized that the only way forward was through forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that erases the past, but the kind that acknowledges the pain and chooses to move forward anyway. I wasn't ready to forgive yet.
I needed more time.
I needed to process the pain and anger and hurt, but I was ready to start the process. I was ready to begin the healing. The next morning, I went to Eleanor's house. The housekeeper let me in, and I walked through the quiet rooms, remembering all the awkward dinners and tense conversations that had taken place there. I found myself in Eleanor's bedroom, and I sat down on the edge of her bed. I opened the box one more time. I looked at the photograph of Sarah, the ring, the letter. And I started to write my own letter. Not to Eleanor, she was gone, but to my husband, to the man I still loved, even after everything. I wrote about the pain of the past 15 years, about the confusion and self-doubt and the feeling of never being enough, about the relief of finally understanding what had been going on, and about my decision to move forward, to let go of the anger and hurt, to give us a chance to heal. I was halfway through the letter when I heard a sound behind me. I turned, and Daniel was standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was something hopeful in his expression. I couldn't stay away, he said. I know you need time, and I know you're still angry, but I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed to see you. I needed to try to make this right. I looked at him, this man I'd loved for 15 years, this man who had hurt me so deeply. And I saw the same fear I'd seen when Sarah had left him, the same vulnerability, the same desperation to be loved and accepted. I'm not ready to forgive you, I said.
Not yet.
But I'm ready to try. I'm ready to work on this, together. But I need you to be honest with me from now on. No more secrets. No more hiding. I need to know that I can trust you." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I promise. I swear to you, Lydia. No more secrets. I'll tell you everything. I'll never hide anything from you again." I stood up and walked over to him, taking his hands in mine. I looked into his eyes, and I saw the man I'd fallen in love with. The man who had been so broken that he'd forgotten how to trust. The man who had carried the weight of his past for too long.
"I love you," I said.
"I've always loved you, even when I didn't understand what was going on. Even when I felt like I wasn't enough. I loved you." He pulled me into a hug, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. And I held him back, feeling the warmth of his body, the beat of his heart against mine. We stood there for a long time, holding each other and crying. And when we finally pulled apart, I saw something different in his eyes. There was still pain, still regret, but there was also hope. A new beginning. A chance to start over. We spent the rest of the day talking. Really talking for the first time in years. He told me everything about Sarah. How they'd met, how they'd fallen in love, how she'd betrayed him with his own brother. He told me about the years of therapy, the sleepless nights, the slow process of rebuilding his life. And he told me about the day he'd met me and how he'd known, from the first moment, that I was someone special. I told him about the years of insecurity, the feeling of never being enough, the way his mother's coldness had worn me down. I told him about the day I'd opened the box, and how everything had finally made sense. I told him about the anger and hurt and the slow process of working through it. And when we were done talking, I told him what I decided to do with Sarah's ring. I was going to sell it. I didn't want it in our house. Reminder of the woman who had nearly destroyed our family. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "She doesn't get to have power over us anymore," he said. "Not Sarah, not my mother's fear, not any of it. We're going to let it go and move forward." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "Together." "Together," he repeated. We sold the ring at a local jeweler, and we used the money to buy a small bench for the garden. It had a plaque on it that read, "In memory of Eleanor, a woman who loved fiercely and feared deeply." It wasn't a perfect tribute, but it was honest. She had loved fiercely, her son, her family, her sense of order. And she had feared deeply, the past, the future, the possibility of losing anyone else she loved. In a way, her coldness had been a twisted form of protection, a way of keeping everyone at arm's length so she couldn't be hurt again. And I understood that. I didn't approve of it, but I understood it. We planted flowers around the bench, Eleanor's favorite roses, a mix of red and pink that bloomed every spring. Sometimes I sat there and thought about her, and I felt a strange kind of peace. She'd been broken, like all of us. She'd made mistakes, like all of us. But she'd also tried to do the right thing, in her own way. She'd tried to protect her son. She'd tried to explain herself. She'd tried to make amends. I wrote her a letter in my head, a letter I'd never send. I thanked her for the box, for the truth, for finally understanding. I told her I was sorry that fear had overshadowed love, that she'd never gotten to see what her son could become. And I told her that I would take care of him, not out of obligation, but because I loved him. The years passed, and Daniel and I grew closer than we'd ever been. The secret was finally out, and it had brought us together in ways I'd never imagined. We talked about everything now, our fears, our hopes, our dreams. We didn't let anything fester or go unspoken. And we promised each other that we would never let secrets destroy us again. I forgave him, eventually. Not all at once, but slowly, over time. I forgave him for his silence, his fear, his inability to trust me with his past. And I forgave his mother for her coldness, her fear, her inability to see me as I really was. But I also made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone make me feel small again. I would never let anyone question my worth or make me feel like I wasn't enough. I was enough. I'd always been enough. And now I knew it. The revenge I'd wanted, the justice I'd sought, ended up being something very different than what I'd imagined. It wasn't about punishment or making anyone suffer. It was about healing. It was about understanding. It was about choosing to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. Did I sit on the bench in the garden sometimes, watching the roses bloom. Daniel comes out to join me, bringing 2 cups of tea, and we sit together in the quiet.
Sometimes we talk.
Sometimes we just enjoy the silence, comfortable in each other's presence in a way we never used to be. The box sits in the back of my closet, but I don't need it anymore. I know what's inside, a secret that was finally revealed, a truth that set us free. I kept the photograph of Sarah, not as a reminder of what I almost lost, but as a reminder of how far we've come. Sometimes I look at it and think about the woman who looked so much like me, the woman whose brokenness nearly destroyed my family. And I feel sorry for her in a way. She was running from something too, just like Eleanor and Daniel and all of us. We're all running from something. The past, the pain, the fear of being hurt again. But eventually you have to stop running. Eventually you have to turn around and face the thing that's chasing you. I turned around and faced it. And I found that it wasn't nearly as scary as I'd thought. If you enjoyed this story of secrets, betrayal, and the power of forgiveness, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I'm sharing real stories from people who faced impossible situations and found a way through them. Some stories end in revenge. Some end in healing. And some, like this one, end with a little bit of both. Let me know in the comments below. If you discovered a secret like this, would you confront the person who kept it from you? Would you choose forgiveness? Or would you walk away? I'm curious to hear what you do. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a garden to tend to.